I am Elizabeth Dark, and on behalf of the Kenyon Review, the English Department, and the GLCA, I welcome you and thank you for joining us this afternoon. We are coming toward the end of our Kenyon Review Literary Festival week. We began this whole thing last month with our Knox Reads, which included community discussions and readings here at the Mount Vernon branch of the Public Library, Paragraphs Bookstore, as well as we gave away free books in the farmers market. I see a lot of people here that helped with that. This week we've had readings, workshops, musical performances, panels, and it's been a fantastic week. But we are coming to the close. We have this reading, and then tomorrow night we have Read a Dove coming at 8 o'clock in Ross Hall, free, open to the public. Please come. But today, we are happy to be hosting our second GLCA New Writers Award recipient of the week. The New Writers Award is sponsored by the 13 members of the Great Lakes Colleges Association, that's the GLCA, to recognize newly published writers and to introduce the best among them to students and faculty on GLCA campuses. Since 1970, the GLCA awards authors for a first published volume of poetry, fiction, and creative nonfiction. And each award winner has the opportunity to tour the 13 colleges, giving readings and engaging students and faculty. I'd now like to welcome up Catherine Weber, one of our English professors and editor at large for the Kenyon Review, to introduce to us Emily Fridlund.
Okay, Fridlund. It is Fridlund. Okay, so welcome to the penultimate reading in what has been an incredible, rich week of celebration of literature in the truest sense that is the KR Festival. Emily Fridlund has a PhD in literature and creative writing from USC, where she wrote about simultaneity in modernist and contemporary narratives by women. See, that interests me right away. She's a senior lecturer in English at Cornell. Last year, Emily published both her debut novel and her debut collection of short stories in the same year. So that's a pretty amazing thing, and even more amazingly, her collection, Catapult, won the Mary McCarthy Prize, which includes publication by Sarabande Books, and that was judged by Ben Marcus. So a great writer judged it, and it's a prize named for a fantastic writer of short fiction. Her first novel, History of Wolves, was a finalist for both the 2017 Man Booker Prize, wow, and the Penn Robert Bingham Prize for debut fiction. And that's also a prize named for a marvelous young writer who died all too soon of a heroin overdose, actually. And it's an important award. And her novel won the American Academy of Arts and Letters Sue Kaufman Prize for first fiction, another award named for a great writer who actually took her own life. I don't mean to be so dark about this, but that's how you get awards named for you, I think. Not Mary McCarthy, she did okay. So most significantly for us, History of Wolves won the Great Lakes College Association New Writers Award, which is why we are so lucky to have her here today. And the words of praise from the judges who chose this book are just as fulsome as anything I've ever seen. And I have written some of these words of praise, and I didn't go this far. They call it a highly inventive first novel, and note that it explores the devastating consequences of isolation, both emotional and physical, and how far lonely people will compromise their own morality, turning a blind eye to the obvious, believing delusions, to achieve love and communion. History of Wolves presents a strong narrative voice that brilliantly interweaves dramatic actions, emotional upshots, and character development. They call the novel layered, raw, and heartbreaking, as it tells a story that is both intimate and monumental. So please join me in welcoming Emily Fridlund.
Thank you so much, Catherine, and the Kenyon Review, Kenyon College, and the Great Lakes Colleges Association. This is fantastic to be here on campus. Thank you all for coming out at the end of a day, at the end of a week, at the end of a semester, more or less. It's good to see you all. I'm going to read from my novel, History of Wolves, today. And I think I'll start at the beginning, read just a little bit, and then I'll jump into some of the plot, such as it is. This book, I think, hopefully, it could be said to be about a lot of things, but at least one of those things is looking back and trying to make sense of events that happened a long time ago, and the process of doing that. It's not that I never think about Paul. He comes to me occasionally before I'm fully awake, though I almost never remember what he said or what I did or didn't do to him. In my mind, the kid just plops down into my lap. Boom. That's how I know it's him. There's no interest in me, no hesitation. We're sitting in the nature center on a late afternoon like any other, and his body moves automatically toward mine, not out of love or respect, but simply because he hasn't yet learned the etiquette of minding where his body stops and another begins. He's 4. He's got an owl puzzle to do. Don't talk to him. I don't. Outside the window, an avalanche of poplar fluff floats by, silent and weightless as air. The sunlight shifts. The puzzle cleaves into an owl and comes apart again. I prod Paul to standing. Time to go. It's time. But in the second before we rise, before he whines out his protest and asks to stay a little longer, he leans back against my chest, yawning, and my throat cinches closed. Because it's strange, you know. It's marvelous and sad, too, how good it can feel to have your body taken for granted. Before Paul, I'd known just one person who'd gone from living to dead. He was Mr. Adler, my 8th grade history teacher. He wore brown corduroy suits and white tennis shoes, and though his subject was America, he preferred to talk about czars. He once showed us a photograph of Russia's last emperor, and that's how I think of him now, black-bearded, tassel-shouldered, though in fact Mr. Adler was always clean-shaven and plodding. I was in English class when his 4th period student burst in saying Mr. Adler had fallen. We crowded across the hall, and there he lay face down on the floor, eyes closed, blue lips suctioning the carpet. Does he have epilepsy? Someone asked. Does he have pills? We were all repulsed. The Boy Scouts argued over proper CPR techniques, while the gifted and talented kids reviewed his symptoms in hysterical whispers. I had to force myself to go to him. I crouched down and took Mr. Adler's dry, neat hand. It was early November. He was darkening the carpet with drool, gasping in air between longer and longer intervals, and I remember a distant bonfire scent. Someone was burning garbage in plastic bags, some janitor getting rid of leaves and pumpkin rinds before the first big snow. When the paramedics finally loaded Mr. Adler's body onto a stretcher, the Boy Scouts trailed behind like puppies, hoping for an assignment. They wanted a door to open, something heavy to lift. In the hallway, girls stood sniffling in clumps. A few teachers held their palms to their chests, uncertain what to say or do next. That a Doors song? One of the paramedics asked. He'd stayed behind to pass out packets of saltines to lightheaded students. I shrugged. I must have been humming out loud. He gave me orange Gatorade in a Dixie cup, saying, as if I were the one he'd come to save, as if his duty were to root out sickness in whatever living thing he could find. Drink slow now. Do it in sips. The walleye capital of the world, we were called back then. There was a sign to this effect out on Route 10 and a mural of 3 mohawked fish on the side of the diner. Those guys were always waving a finny hello, grins and eyebrows, teeth and gums, but no one came from out of town to fish or do much at all once the big lakes froze up in November. We didn't have the resort in those days, only a seedy motel. Downtown went diner, hardware, bait and tackle, bank. The most impressive place in Loose River back then was the old timber mill, I think, and that was because it was half burned down, charred black planks towering over the banks of the river. Almost everything official, the hospital and DMV and Burger King and police station, were 20+ miles down the road in Whitewood. The day the Whitewood paramedics took Mr. Adler away, they tooted the ambulance horn as they left the school parking lot. We all stood at the windows and watched, even the hockey players in their yellowed caps, even the cheerleaders with their static, charged bangs. Snow was coming down by then, hard. As the ambulance slid around the corner, its headlights raked crazily through the flurries gusting across the road. Shouldn't there be sirens? Someone asked. And I thought, measuring the last swallow of Gatorade in my little waxed cup, how stupid can people be? So as you can tell, this is a story set up in the North Woods of Minnesota. That being said, the book actually began in Southern California, of all places. I was out in California and living in LA at the time when I began the story that ultimately became this novel. It came out of, on some level, a resistance that I felt. I was in a workshop that I think just coincidentally had, we'd been assigned to read two books that took the perspective of a male teacher and his attraction to a younger female student. And to me at the time, this was kind of an old trope, a tired trope. And I was feeling frustrated by it. And so I decided to just begin a story from the perspective of a girl watching a teacher. That girl is not an object of sexual attention, actually. She's not been transformed into a sexual object, but she can see how that might happen, that there's a kind of ambiguous and strange power that is conferred upon the girls that have been transformed in this way, highly ambiguous, actually. And so she's watching that happen, and that was part of what motivated me to dive into this voice, this overlooked, lonely, isolated kid. And I guess I should say the other thing that motivated me. I was in California and I was missing winter of all things. It's hard for me to imagine this now. I live in upstate New York, and here we are beginning the long winter, 6 months of winter. I'm sure you all can identify. But in California, the seasons moved, but they moved in a different way than I was familiar with. And so writing this place and being in this world, in this wintry, cold, icy world, was a way to imaginatively inhabit a place that I had left behind. And so I wanted to live there for a while in my head. As I said, this is a book about this lonely girl. It takes the voice of the adult Madeline or Linda or Maddie, depending on which character you're talking to. But the adult, looking back on a few important events when she's 14 or 15 years old. She was born into a back-to-the-land style commune that broke up when she was really little, and she's been raised in sort of the remnants of this commune on the edge of a little lake, on the edge of a little town in the middle of the North Woods. And her very isolated world is punctured by a couple events. The first is when Mr. Adler dies and a new teacher comes into town. And the second is when a new family moves in across the lake from where she lives. And I was thinking a lot about putting two kind of parallel plots side by side, plots that were causally not related, not connected. But by thinking of them in kind of the same context, I was interested in thinking about how one plot could resonate with the other, or bring out a kind of contrast with the other. So I wanted to read from the first plot, the teacher plot, Mr. Grierson, just a few pages, maybe 1 or 2 pages, and then we'll move to the babysitter plot. So Mr. Adler's replacement was Mr. Grierson, and he arrived a month before Christmas with a deep, otherworldly tan. He wore one gold hoop earring and a brilliant white shirt with pearly buttons. We learned later that he'd come from California, from a private girls' school on the sea. No one knew what brought him all the way to northern Minnesota midwinter, but after the first week of class, he took down Mr. Adler's maps of the Russian Empire and replaced them with enlarged copies of the U.S. Constitution. He announced he'd double majored in theater in college, which explained why he stood in front of the class one day with his arms outstretched, reciting the whole Declaration of Independence by heart. Not just the soaring parts about life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, but the needling, wretched list of tyrannies against the colonies. I could see how badly he wanted to be liked. "What does it mean?" Mr. Grierson asked, when he got to the part about mutually pledging our sacred honor. The hockey players slept innocently on folded hands. Even the gifted and talented kids were unmoved, clicking their mechanical pencils until the lead protruded obscenely like hospital needles. They jousted each other across the aisles. On guard, they hissed contemptuously. Mr. Grierson sat down on Mr. Adler's desk. He was breathless from his recitation, and I realized, in an odd flash, like a too bright light passing over him, he was middle-aged. I could see sweat on his face, his pulse pounding under gray neck stubble. "People, guys, what does it mean that the rights of man are self-evident? Come on, you know this." I saw his eyes rest on Lily Holborn, who had sleek black hair and was wearing, despite the cold, a sheer crimson sweater. He seemed to think her beauty could rescue him, that she would be, because she was prettier than the rest of us, kind. Lily had big brown eyes, dyslexia, no pencil, a boyfriend. Her face slowly reddened under Mr. Grierson's gaze. She blinked. He nodded at her, promising implicitly that whatever she said, he'd agree. She gave a deer-like lick of her lips. I don't know why I raised my hand. It wasn't that I felt sorry for her exactly, or him. It was just that the tension became unbearable for a moment, out of all proportion to the occasion. "It means some things don't have to be proven," I offered. "Some things are simply true. There's no changing them." "That's right," he said, grateful, I knew, not to me in particular, but to some hoop of luck he felt he'd stumbled into. I could do that, give people what they wanted without them knowing it came from me. Without saying a word, Lily could make people feel encouraged, blessed. She had dimples on her cheeks, nipples that flashed like signs from God through her sweater. I was flat-chested, plain as a banister. I made people feel judged. Winter collapsed on us that year. It knelt down exhausted and stayed. In the middle of December, so much snow fell the gym roof buckled and school was canceled for a week. With school out, the hockey players went ice fishing. The Boy Scouts played hockey on the ponds. Then came Christmas with its strings of colored lights up and down Main Street and the competing nativity scenes at the Lutheran and Catholic churches, one with painted sandbags standing in as sheep and the other with baby Jesus sculpted out of a lump of ice. New Year's brought another serious storm. By the time school started again in January, Mr. Grierson's crisp white shirts had been replaced with nondescript sweaters, his hoop earring with a stud. Someone must have taught him to use the Scantron machine because after a week's worth of lectures on Lewis and Clark, he gave his first test. While we hunched in our desks, filling tiny bubbles, he walked up and down the aisles, clicking a ballpoint pen. The next day, Mr. Grierson asked me to stay after class. He sat behind his desk and touched his lips, which were chapped and flaking off beneath his fingers. "You didn't do very well on your exam," he told me. He was waiting for an explanation, and I lifted my shoulders defensively. But before I could say a word, he added, "Look, I'm sorry." He twisted the stud, delicate, difficult screw, in his ear. "I'm still working out the kinks in my lesson plans. What were you studying before I arrived?" "Russia?" "Ah." A look of scorn passed over his face, followed immediately by pleasure. "The Cold War lingers in the back country." I defended Mr. Adler. It wasn't the Soviet Union we were talking about. It was SARS. "Oh, Maddie." No one ever called me that. It was like being tapped on the shoulder from behind. My name was Madeline, but at school I was called Linda, or Kami, or Freak. I pulled my hands into balls in my sleeves. Mr. Grierson went on. "No one cared about the Tsars before Stalin and the bomb. They were puppets on a faraway stage, utterly insignificant. Then all the Mr. Adlers went to college in 1961, and there was general nostalgia for the old Russian toys, the inbred princesses from another century. Their ineffectuality made them interesting. You understand?" He smiled then, closing his eyes a little. His front teeth were white. his canines yellow. But you're 13, 14. I just wanted to say I'm sorry if this has started off badly. We'll get on better footing soon. The next week he asked me to drop by his classroom after school. This time he'd taken the stud out of his ear and set it on his desk. Very tenderly, with his forefinger and thumb, he was probing the flesh around his earlobe. "Maddie," he said, straightening up. He had me sit in a blue plastic chair behind his desk. He set a stack of glossy brochures on my lap, made a teepee of his fingers. "Do me a favor, but don't blame me for having to ask. That's my job," he squirmed. That's when he asked me to be the school's representative in History Odyssey. "This will be great," he said, unconvincingly. "What you do is make a poster, then you give a speech about Vietnam War registers, border crossings to Canada, etc. Or maybe you do the desecration of the Ojibwe peoples, or those back to the land folks that settled up here. Something local, something ethically ambiguous, something with constitutional implications." "I want to do wolves," I told him. "What? A history of wolves?" He was puzzled. Then he shook his head and grinned. "Right. You're a 14-year-old girl." The skin bunched up around his eyes. "You all have a thing for horses and wolves." I love that. I love that. That's so weird. What is that about? So, of course, this is the title of the book, History of Wolves. And I guess one of the questions, if you haven't read the book, I've often gotten the question first, is this about wolves? And so for those of you, fair warning, for those of you who have not read it, don't go into it expecting a lot of wolves. There aren't a lot of wolves. There is, I'd like to show off this beautiful wolf on the inside cover of the hardback. And there's a taxidermy stuffed wolf in the novel. But often the second question I get then is like, what do the wolves represent? What's the metaphorical meaning of wolves in this book? And when I'm asked that, I tend to point back to this early chapter, this first chapter, the scene. Linda ends up getting up and standing at a podium like this and giving her wolf presentation and quoting from a real history of wolves by Barry Lopez. Has anyone here read Barry Lopez's work? Yeah, it's really great. Essentially saying something to the effect that the alpha wolf is only alpha in certain times for a specific reason. And this is the idea that's really compelling to Linda, this overlooked, poor, lonely, isolated kid. The idea that power might be ever-shifting, it might be context-based, that the fixed hierarchies that she's encountering in the world, that between teacher and student, or parent and child, or male, female, might sometimes be flipped or changed, is something that's very compelling to her. And so that's sort of why I wanted to call the book that on some level. I don't think I'm revealing too much in saying the first chapter, which was originally a story, ends with Mr. Grierson being accused of possessing child pornography and being fired. And so I knew when I wrote that first chapter, which was a story, I thought I was done, but there was something about the voice and also the place, and also probably the questions, the ethical questions at the heart of that story that I wanted to go back to. I was interested in questions about thinking and action, the relationship between the two, witness and responsibility, and especially guilt. And so thinking through those questions in a completely different context, in the context of Linda in a house as a babysitter for this family across the lake, became a way for me to sort of resituate some of those questions, the more familiar questions, in unfamiliar terms, at least to me. So I want to give you a little taste of that second plot that kind of initially runs parallel and then really takes over the book in a lot of ways. So Linda is a babysitter for this family that moves in. The father's gone, he's a scientist, and the mother, Patra, hires her, Linda, to watch this little 4-year-old boy for a couple hours each day. And sometimes Linda lingers and has dinner with them. She begins to notice that something is not quite right in the household, but for lots of reasons, doesn't initially put her finger on what that is. I'm not saying he was especially difficult to manage, but he did have a ferocious streak. This is Paul. Somewhere in him there was a sharp line drawn between order and chaos. Paul's the older boy, I should say. He did not tolerate, for instance, any break in his routine. If occasionally I lingered after I brought him back, if Patra laid out an extra plate and showed me how to whisk oil and lemon for a dressing, Paul would grow increasingly clingy, possessive. All through dinner, he'd beg to sit on Patra's lap, and by the end, he'd work his way up and nuzzle her neck. She'd fork lettuce into her mouth with one hand, pet his blonde hair with the other. There was one night in particular. Paul was whiny, and Patra was casting about for something other than trains and bath time to talk about. I remember how she pushed back her bowl, set her chin in her palm, and pointed herself at me. "Okay, Linda," she said. There was something unsettled about her that night, a frenzy of tiny movements in the skin around her eyes. "Tell me, you're one of those girls who wants to raise horses or something, be a vet when she grows up. I can tell, I'm right, aren't I? That's what you want to be." I wasn't one of those girls, actually. I didn't think much about the future, but when I did, all I could come up with was the weird image of a semi-truck, white and floating down the highway. Of course, I couldn't say that. I couldn't say truck driver. So, to stall, I looked across the table at Paul, who was inching from his chair to the floor, singing, "I want to be a physicist. I want to be a physicist." Patra was just teasing, though, I could tell. She didn't really care what I said, as long as I played along. She wanted something to do before clearing the table, before coaxing Paul toward bed, a distraction before the husband called. "I could be a vet," I said, offering myself up. "Sure." "Or no," Patra pulled one bent leg under her. "I've got something better for you. I'm good at this kind of thing. Let's see, you, Linda, you deserve something you haven't seen, a city to explore, you know? A bunch of people trying to get in your doors. You should be," she snapped her fingers, flashing a grin, "a hotelier, a restaurateur." She looked so pleased. "A restaurateur?" Paul asked. I grunted to keep from smiling. "Like a waitress?" I did that already. I swept my hand across the room like, "What's all this then? I quit for you." She widened her eyes, feigned shock. "You left the restaurant business to be a babysitter? That's a whole lot of pressure for us here, isn't it, Paul? We should give you a better title then. Where did the word babysitter come from anyway?" I shrugged. "An ugly word, right? Should we call you nanny instead?" No, that sounds like an old lady. What about governess? Ooh, let's call you governess." She was laughing now. "That's so much better. A babysitter would never be hired for Flora and Miles. You read The Turn of the Screw? Or a babysitter couldn't fall in love with Mr. Rochester, right? And be the heroine. Governess you are." "Governess," Paul shouted from under the table. He waited for Patra to define it, and when she didn't, he pulled a fist of pebbles from his stash in the glove and threw them. "Watch it," I told him. To Patra, "I don't know, I'm not sure. Sounds like kind of a sissy thing to be. Plus, people will think you're like millionaires or something." I was trying to keep from smiling at her. "You're right," Patra pouted. "Time for my bath," Paul pouted too. He crawled from the floor onto her lap. Patra let him nestle into her chest while she stroked his hair. She patted his cheek, but her eyes were on me. "You're right, Linda, you're right. People here already think I'm a snob or something, an anomaly." She furrowed her brow, following a new train of thought. "I'm still figuring this place out, what's what. It's funny, I've been to the diner with Paul 4, maybe 5 times, for lunch. I see the same people every time I go in, and they all look at me, they all smile and say hi, but no one has asked me one thing about myself, not my name, not a thing. People are nice in a way, but also not," I said. She pulled Paul's hand away from the buttons on her shirt, so he took up her hair instead, winding his fingers in her blonde curls. "Was it a good idea to come here?" she asked me now. "The idea was that while Leo was in Hawaii this spring, we'd come out to the new summer house, go somewhere quiet and nice, just me and Paul as a kind of hideout." "A hideout from what?" She spun her free hand around in a general way. You on the run? I teased. You rob a bank over there in Illinois? Ha ha ha, she said. Paul was yanking on her hair, not hard, but slowly and repeatedly. If so, no one cares too much what you do here, so long as you keep to yourself, I joked. And don't, take all the good fishing spots. I winced at how lame a line it was. But that didn't keep me from trying again. And as long as you're not something really unforgivable, like divorced or an atheist or something, gentleman. Petra was prying open Paul's fingers, pulling out her hair. Or, Paul, stop. She scooted him at last off her lap, patting his rump to offset the burst of irritation in her voice. Go get your puzzle, bucko. Let's do the owl puzzle, how about? When he'd left, she started stacking plates and bowls, making noise, moving quickly. Then she sat down again, suddenly. I really don't know if it's a great thing for us, all this quiet. Why did I think it would be a good thing for us? Maybe it would be better for Paul to go back to preschool, to be around people who... Maybe it wasn't such a good idea to come here in the first place. She looked up at me then, and there was something I didn't expect in her eyes. It's still a pretty good idea, I said, unsettled by her guilty expression. So you can see, maybe from that piece that I just read, I was reading quite a lot of 19th century fiction. Especially these old great governess stories, The Turn of the Screw and Jane Eyre. And I was thinking a lot about how governess plays this really weird and peripheral role, right? Peripheral and yet central at the same time. And how that sort of allows access to a family, while also, often that the governess is kept out of the deepest secrets of a family. And of course, the contemporary equivalent of a governess is a babysitter, and Linda plays that role. She sees and doesn't see, knows and doesn't know at the same time that something is very wrong in this household. And increasingly, as the novel goes on, her initial ignorance, because of her inner experience and her youth, that ignorance slides potentially into self-deception. And that's what she's working through as an adult, trying to think about what does it mean to stand by and watch something terrible happen, and what are our responsibilities in that context. I think I'll leave it there and open up to questions, perhaps.
What drew you or thinking is to write about a narrator that's looking back on loneliness associated with maybe like high school years or loneliness in a high school experience?
So the question is, what was it like just thinking back about high school?
Yeah, and what drew you to write about writing loneliness in the context of a high school experience or looking back on a high school experience?
Yeah, good question. I mean, I am so interested in the teenage narrator in general. It's such a peculiar age. So she's 14 and 15 in this book, for most of the book. The main events of the book happen. And it actually was really important to me. She's 15. The little boy that she's taking care of is Paul, who's 4. So there's 11 years between then. And then Patra, the mother, is 26. And so she sits right in between, intentionally right in between childhood and adulthood. And there's a kind of sliding that happens in the book. She sometimes identifies more with Paul, who's really, a kid, basically. She's a kid herself occasionally. And then other times she's very much the adult in the room. And that's something I just find really interesting about the teenage narrator in general. High school in particular is just, it's a wilderness itself, right? And so, I didn't grow up in the wilderness. I grew up in a lovely suburb in the Twin Cities. So the high school experiences that I'm writing about actually are far more autobiographical, probably, than any of the Northwoods writing. And to some extent, I think a lot of kids feel this kind of intense isolation in that period of their lives. And so what I wanted to do is just press on it. Let's see what it looks like if it's even more intense. And that was kind of the experiment with Linda. I always thought that she was the kind of narrator that was hobbled in some ways by her isolation and also empowered by that isolation, that the kind of watching habit actually makes it possible occasionally for her to see things about other people that they can't see about themselves. So I was thinking a lot about that. What does it give her, and what does it take from her at the same time? Yeah.
Did you nail it in the first draft, or did you have to revise? And if so, did editors request you to revise, or was it so-called friends?
Oh, it's a hard question. So I had this really wonderful experience of, while I was a student at USC, I had a wonderful advisor, Amy Bender. I don't know if anyone here knows her work, but she's an incredible writer and also an incredible teacher. And she just offered, I had to leave the school for some reasons, and I was away from the writing community for a while, and she offered just to read pages. And so I just gave her a lot of pages. And mostly she was just encouraging me to keep going. And that first draft came out quite quickly initially, just within a couple of months probably. After the short story, after I decided to extend the short story, the first draft was written quite quickly. I did a revision over time and really thought I had finished it. And it felt really complete to me, and it was very humbling when I gave it to my agent who asked for a revision, and then I gave it, she gave it to, she sold the novel and then gave it to my editor, and she wanted a revision, and then the editor had an assistant who wanted a revision. And every time, each time I thought I was done, right? Like nobody told me that there was another round probably on the table, and even the copy editor came in and did a lot of work on the sentence level, and I would say I fought a lot of those changes, and I'm not sure I would recommend that to anyone. I don't know if it reflects what it reflects about me, but I'm always shocked at how actually similar the book is to the initial drafts. When I go back and look at my notebooks, my handwritten notebooks, there's some whole passages that are just identical word for word. But it was a hard process of deciding to keep some of those sentences. And I'm not sure, maybe it would have been a better book if I had followed more of the advice of some of the people down the way, down in the process, the editors down the line. But for whatever reason, I had this, sort of the litmus test for me was I wanted the ambition of the book not to be written out of it through the editing process. And that was a challenge. There's always that question, we want to sell this book, and so how can we make it a more familiar book? And so that was a bit of a fight, I will say. Yeah.
I have a related question. What, if anything, did you have to do to your short story over the course of writing the novel to make it into the first chapter?
Yeah, so that story, long before I extended the novel, that story was published in the Sou'wester Review, so you can probably go and look at it. There's not too much that's different, actually. But the pieces with Paul was not in that story. The pieces with the babysitting, the retrospect. So there's a couple sentences and paragraphs that I put in after I kind of expanded the piece. But most of that is pretty similar, actually. Yeah, pretty similar. Yeah.
So I was really interested in the many subtle turns that the narrative takes, and I kept thinking it was going in one direction and then it would veer somewhere else, right? But if the story as it kind of is very close to the short story, I'm curious about, I'm trying to give it away since I don't give it away to anyone who hasn't read it, but does it in some ways start from the end? So is it much more centered on Paul and Petra and Leah, and then is that when the short story sort of really emerged, as opposed to how the narrative takes sort of shape, starting with some school and Linda's own family life, and then leading to that encounter with the family, so.
Yeah, no, it really starts with, my initial short story was really about Mr. Gerson and the teacher, and the school situation. It was the voice, and then, as I said, the questions at the heart of that story that I found compelling enough to go back to and interesting enough to go back to and want to think more about in this kind of other context as well. And yeah, I mean, there was a way in which it's a very circular novel in a way, right? And it has sort of spirals. I hope it moves forward on some level, but it's kind of, in some ways, I think it's best described as a book about the nature of retrospect, right? And the ways in which the mind returns and returns and returns to key events and rethinks them. And so there is that sort of constant move 2 steps forward and then 1 step back in the book as we move through the chronological telling.
Are you tempted to enlarge any of your other published stories into a novel, or are they resolved and complete as they are?
Those are I think, at this point.
So what was different about this one?
Yeah, so that's, I get asked that often, and I often wonder, what is it? Again, I think it was these 3 things, 3 elements. One is the voice, is the character, and I think I finished that story and just thought she's interesting enough, and yet she hasn't burned herself out as a voice. So a lot of my stories, I felt like I'd be interested in them, but whatever about, they were unusual enough that they would burn themselves out over a shorter period or a shorter piece. She was interesting to me. She didn't reveal herself to me. I didn't really know a lot about her, and it took the writing to figure her out. Interesting enough to me to stay with her for several years, the years that it takes to write and revise and finish a book. So probably largely the voice, I would say. But also the place was really vivid to me too in that first short story. And people often think of places background, setting as background, and for me, it's not that at all. It's so much of the work of understanding who a person is how they see, and so that's describing the world around them. And so because she was seeing so clearly, I felt like I could see her world and could spend time looking at it with her. And then again, I was just really interested in guilt. I wanted to write about guilt and how that worked.
Okay, well, I think we have time for maybe one more question, and then there are books for sale in the back. There's a question.
Yeah, I have a question on the 19th century novel, and I mean the experience of reading those novels and their overwhelming nature, and then what your process was of, I guess, I don't know, staying true to your own tone, and as someone who reveres those novels, how do you balance your reverence for those, but also trying to adapt it into something that feels authentically yours? Yeah.
Yeah, so I was reading a lot of those books, and I didn't think of them as influencing my work. I have to say, I wasn't trying to rewrite Jane Eyre. I didn't. If I did do that, I didn't try. It wasn't my goal. That being said, at some point in the writing process, I realized that reading influenced how I thought when I was writing about it. So I wanted to just put it in the text, and it was easy enough because Patra is an English major, and so she could talk about that in a way that Linda could not at all. She doesn't have that education or background, and doesn't think like me. Thinks through her body. She's a person who chops wood and paddles across the lake in her canoe, and so she was distant enough from that kind of reading that I could allow little bits of it to come in through other characters and didn't have to situate it in her. But yeah, when I realized, okay, essentially I'm writing a governance story here, I better have someone say so. There's one more question in the back. Did you have a question in the back?
Is there a question? No, I think it was the bookseller.
Oh, the bookseller.
Oh, His question is, how many people are going to buy books?
Thank you so much.